My name is Derek Olson. I'm the president of WorldOregon. It's my honor to welcome you here today. Thank you again for your patience as we came through. I promise that it's always the busiest the first week as people are checking in and buying books and the like. So thank you for those who had to stand in line a little bit longer than they would have preferred. I apologize for that. As you might have seen in the emails, why we are doing this, and Tim will talk about this too, is your entrance fees help us pay for the streaming, which then allows for this to go out throughout the state, where we have a group, for instance, in Bend that's going to be joining to watch this, where we have some school groups and university groups, and then let us later put the talks up on YouTube so that many more people can benefit. So Portland State is a great partner. They actually give us this room, but there's some costs in the AV, and that allows us really to reach more people. So you helping to pay for that really helps expand the reach of Great Decisions. So I greatly appreciate that you do that. We have an exciting program here today. Tim is going to introduce the speaker and also talk about our upcoming events. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and appreciate your support. Those who come to Great Decisions are some of our most faithful and loyal supporters over the years, and it means a great deal for us. And I know that we've had a lot of changes in the last year. For those who haven't heard, we have a new name that we're using, although it's not wrong to call us the World Affairs Council of Oregon. We're just doing business as WorldOregon. We have a new website, and we're really trying to communicate better through not only through words, but also pictures and videos about how we are implementing our mission to connect you in this region with the world. So I appreciate your support and your patience, as I know it's been a year of a lot of changes, and we're looking forward to diving into some of our old standard work that you love so much, like Great Decisions, the International Speaker Series, our exchange programs, and others. Tim will talk to you about some of those coming up. So thank you for your being with us through the change, and I hope that you will really enjoy an exciting 2018. Tim's going to give you a preview of some of the things coming up, not only in Great Decisions, but some of our other work. And thanks again, and I'll pass it over to Tim.
It is so good to see you all back here again. I've been doing this series now for, I think this is my 8th year. And it's kind of like having a family reunion every January when you guys all come back in. So, as Derek said, this is one of our longest standing programs. And I'm sure I've told you this before, but I love repeating it, that we were the pilot program for Great Decisions in the U.S. In 1954, this program started here in Portland, and we've been doing it ever since. So it is a legacy brand, and whether we are the World Affairs Council of Oregon, which is so many syllables, or WorldOregon, we will always continue to do this in some shape or form. So thanks for being here today. A couple things coming up. As Derek mentioned, remember we are live streaming, so be on your best behavior. There is no mosh pit. When we get to the Q&A, I will walk around with the microphone because we want to make sure that for all the kiddies at home, they can hear the questions. So don't shout out. That always makes me crazy. January 31st, in our offices, we're doing a program with John Rudolph, who is a wonderful photojournalist. We've presented programs with him in the past. He has been documenting the refugee crises around the world. He was in the Isle of Lesbos last year. He was at the Greek-Macedonian border after that. He just came back from Bangladesh, where he has been documenting the Rohingya crisis. And so he will be presenting a program called Loss of Home, Loss of Hope, picturing the Rohingya crisis. And that'll be the 31st in our office at noon. His photos are very, very powerful. And he's been a great friend to the council, so I hope you can join us for that. Next week in here, for our second Great Decisions, we will have Christopher McKnight-Nichols, who is the director of OSU's Center for Humanities, and he will be talking on the waning of Pax Americana, which is a really great topic right now. Without dilly-dallying much further, I want to say that I'm happy to have Ambassador Kenneth Fairfax joining us again. He's spoken for us, I think last year, right after the elections, because everyone was looking at what the heck was going on with Russia, and has spoken for us for our youth forums here at PSU in the past as well. He is a retired member of the career Senior Foreign Service of the U.S. In addition to serving as U.S. Ambassador to Kazakhstan and as the Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia at the National Security Council, he also served in Moscow in the early years following the fall of communism, as well as in Ukraine and Poland. Other overseas assignments took him to Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Oman, and Canada, and we are lucky to have him here in our own backyard. So give Ambassador Fairfax a big hand.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you can see from the blank screen, that this is going to be one of those dog and pony shows that has neither a dog nor a pony, just me. Now, while I was invited here to talk about Russia's foreign policy with Professor Alan Lynch's piece as a starting point, I actually want to start with a quick note about basic tradecraft, both for diplomats and for politicians. And that is, no matter what question somebody asks you, always answer the question you want to answer. So, you might have guessed it, I'm going to stray just a little bit from the topic. My goal is, rather than simply telling you what, or trying to tell you, what Russia's foreign policy is, I want to give you some thoughts on how you can assess all the different writings and talks you might hear and TV talking heads, or even scholarly articles, in order to make up your own mind about which ones are telling the truth and which ones are missing the mark. To do this, I'll need to dip a toe or two into Soviet and Russian history and domestic policy, because after all, foreign policy is simply a way of accomplishing domestic goals. To keep things simple, I'll start with 5 points to keep in mind whenever you're hearing or reading about Russian foreign policy. Point number 1, if someone uses impeccable American or European logic when analyzing Russian foreign policy, they are probably going to reach the wrong conclusion. Despite all the changes that have taken place in Moscow, including the fall of the Soviet Union itself, this rule of thumb is as true today as it was decades and generations ago. One example that immediately comes to mind was that of recent analyses by very smart people like David Ignatius at the Washington Post or Eric Sasson at the New Republic, who have written and concluded that Putin's decision to attempt to undermine US elections and help Trump get elected have backfired, or in Sasson's word, backfired spectacularly. The authors are smart people, but they are dead wrong. Putin's strategy not only succeeded, it succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. One reason why smart people, reach the wrong conclusion is because they think of it as Americans. They sort of weigh up the costs and benefits. And it's like, oh, you've got sanctions, you've got international opprobrium, you have all these tensions. Yeah, that's all true. And if you were evaluating, say, a US policy, that might be the way you would do it. But that sort of bottom line political analysis means nothing in Russia and less than nothing to Putin. Putin's election meddling campaign was nothing new. It was an extension of a policy that's been around at least since the start of the Soviet Union, and some would argue it goes back to Catherine the Great. It is a policy to undermine faith in democracy, in Western institutions, democratic institutions, rule of law, on which all democracies are based. Alan Lynch got this one right. As he correctly noted, when Putin ordered interference into the US election, his number one target was not the US at all. My view, little different than Lynch's, is that Putin's number one target was Russia itself, and that his secondary target was what is referred to as the near abroad in Russian, Nizhny Zarubezhon. And in foreign policy circles, that means those countries that are basically either now or at some point in the past connected to Russia. By undermining faith in democratic institutions, and the USA was traditionally, or has been traditionally viewed as the world's democratic leader since at least World War II, Putin was undermining the basis for anti-government and pro-democracy groups in Moscow and abroad. The fact that such results are hard to quantify doesn't mean they're not real and that they were not the motivating factor for Putin's actions. Undermining faith in democratic institutions is important because if people believe that all governments are corrupt, all politicians lie, all these words about democracy and rule of law are nothing more than hollow slogans used by greedy people to hide their true intentions, well, then there's actually no reason to resist Russian domination or try to throw off the autocrat you know for the autocrat you don't. A secondary target of this attack was the developing world. Just like his Soviet predecessors, Putin seeks to cultivate the developing world as client states. Once again, undermining faith in democratic institutions help pursue that goal. After all, highly democratic countries are unlikely to decide to align themselves with Russia. Now, a third driving force behind Putin's decision, and those of all of his predecessors, to meddle in the US election was indeed targeted toward the United States, but in a little different way than some people might imagine. The goal was to have the US so divided and so mired in corruption charges and political divisions that President Hillary Clinton, and Putin really thought it would be President Hillary Clinton, would be unable to pursue an effective foreign policy abroad. In other words, he wanted the US to withdraw from the international sphere so that Russia and Putin could move in more fully. Now, readouts from multiple sources inside Moscow have made it very clear that Putin did not actually expect Donald Trump to win. He just wanted to basically sow decision in order to make a mess. The fact that Donald Trump did win means that Putin won more than he could ever imagine. Oh, sure, there's those pesky sanctions. Yes, those are real. But you know what? The sanctions existed before the election, and if Hillary Clinton had been elected, they probably would be worse than they are today. Not only that, the new sanctions passed by Congress aren't really in effect because the Trump administration has never issued implementing regulations for most of them, which means that they're just sitting on the books, but not in practice. So on the whole, the downsides aren't much. Now also, it's true that Trump might not have ended up being the president who is as pro-Russia as some people hoped and other people feared, but he is withdrawing the United States from the international stage in contentious places around the globe. That vacuum is an opportunity, and I'll talk more about that later. Also, the US is increasingly openly allying itself with authoritarian figures around the world. It's no longer a question of human rights and democracy, it's who is our friend, and how you do that is absolutely fine with us. This really fits well into Russia's propaganda campaign in the developing world to say there's really no difference between the US and Russia. Now, ultimately, the only thing that separates what Putin did in the 2016 election and what everyone in the Kremlin has done for more than 100 years is the degree of success. Thanks to a growing distrust in the United States of the political class, thanks to the millions of Americans who get their news from social media in which they participate in self-selecting echo chambers so that all the news they get reinforces all of their preconceived notions. The US was ripe for Putin to succeed in a way that none of his predecessors ever did. So remember, that's my point number one. Point number two, though, is that if someone thinks that Russia's policies are all about the United States, once again, they don't understand Russia, and they're likely to be wrong. Rather than Tip O'Neill's comment on America that all politics is local, I would say in Russia, all politics is domestic. Professor Lynch seemed to either miss this or undervalue the importance of this when looking at Russian foreign policy. While a great number of Russian foreign policies do indeed have an American component or vector to them, the reason those policies exist is not, oh, we hate America or something sort of nebulous like that. It's to advance specific Russian policy goals that begin at home. Something to remember within Russia is that for advancing Russia, in Putin's mind, means, of course, advancing Putin. Now, this is not just me saying this. If you've watched the Russian campaign at all, you'll know that the #1 slogan at Putin rallies and events is Silny President, Silnaya Rossiya. Strong president, strong Russia. That slogan plays upon centuries of Russian tradition, back before the Soviets, this idea that the country, the leader, is a reflection and embodiment of it, and oh, does he do it well. Now, one obvious example of this domestic focus, and also of what I said in my point #1 about Russia's meddling in the United States elections being targeted at home and the near abroad, is that anyone who read those articles about the election interference being only to promote Trump should have said, wait a minute, doesn't make sense. Why does Putin care? And you've got to know that why before you have an idea of what to do. Even in today's world of politicians crying fake news and spouting dubious alternative facts that are then echoed by politically inclined news agencies, lying still has a negative connotation in the United States. Lying is considered bad. That is not true in Russia and has never been. And that brings me to my third point. Russia lies. This is another basic reality that hasn't changed. The Soviet Union lied, Russia lies. If you don't believe me, you could ask Vladimir Lenin, who said, Pravda, это буржуазный предрассудок. Truth, that's a bourgeois preconception. As when George W. Bush said that he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul, anyone who knows anything about Russia should have known immediately that Bush had been duped. Bigly. When President Trump said Putin is sincere in denying meddling in the elections, an alarm should have sounded in your head. So as I said, even in today's world of fake news and lying politicians in the United States, there's something different between us and them. Now, if you think I'm criticizing Putin by saying this, then you're clearly thinking like an American. And you need to think like a Russian if you're going to understand their motivation. Moscow places emphasis on success in advancing its interests. The value of statements, the value of policies, is judged solely by how effective they are in promoting policy outcomes. Remember point #1, again, Moscow views foreign policy strictly as a tool to advance domestic policy. Russians do not label foreign policy as true or false or even moral or immoral. They simply think of them as effective or ineffective. That's what matters. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that Moscow does not and never has published a human rights report in which they lambaste their allies and their opponents alike. And equally, Moscow evaluates policies and countries based upon how useful and how effective they are in advancing Moscow's interests. Point #4. Russians simultaneously believe that Russia is an indomitable world power, feared and respected by all, and that Russia is, and always has been, a long-suffering underdog and victim of vicious, unfounded attacks by the USA and the entire Western world. Now, please, once again, don't think like an American and think that only one of those two statements can be true. Think like a Russian. Many people understand Russia's desire to be or really the world superpower. Many other people understand Russia's long tradition of being a victim and a martyr. One trick to thinking like a Russian is to understand that not only are those two competing things both true at once, but they really fit together quite nicely. Perpetual victimhood is deeply rooted in Slavic culture, particularly so in Russia. Some of you may have heard me in some of my other talks here at PSU, and I do a long riff on the way this martyrdom is reflected in the Russian language itself. I don't have time for that again today, although I do think it's fun. But what I want to do instead is talk about the policy implications of this. A shared feeling of victimhood allows the majority of Russians to believe, for example, that in the upcoming Winter Olympics, the reason why Russia is being excluded is not because Russian athletes are guilty of doping, it's because the anti-Russian propaganda put out by those devious Western powers are fearful of Russian superiority. I'm sure they still believe, even after yesterday or day before, when more than 30 top Russian athletes ran out of a room and then declared they were sick when doping authorities showed up. But they still believe that it's Russian propaganda, and it's easier to believe that when you are the victim. I mean, Russians also know that when devious foreigners try to convince people that Assad is not a good and benign ruler, they're really just trying to undermine Russian world positions by undermining its allies. Because Russia is constantly unfairly attacked, Russians can believe that Russian oligarchs with close links to Putin aren't defrauding the country and bankrupting the economy. That's just foreign propaganda. Likewise, Russians can believe that Ukraine is a legitimate part of Russia, that Russian troops aren't behind the unrest in Ukraine, and many other things that Americans might find hard to swallow. Russians believe the Kremlin on these issues because they fit into the national cultural narrative of Russia as the perpetual victim. Now, being a victim and also an underdog also helps support my previous point. Russia lies. If you're the victim, you're the underdog, then all is fair in love and war. You must do what you must do to succeed. The underdog and victim mentality also fits with Russia's belief in its ultimate superiority. After all, the reason all those foreigners are attacking Russia, the United States, but also Western Europe, Japan, etc., is that they're jealous of Russia's greatness and are always trying to take it down a notch. Putin's foreign and domestic policies are heavily geared towards supporting and enhancing this national narrative. Like his predecessors in the Kremlin dating back 100 years, or hundreds of years, well before the start of the Soviet Union, Putin is not only the leader of Russia, he is its symbol. Remember, silny president, silnaya Россия. So it stands to reason that anyone who attacks Putin is really, of course, attacking all of Russia. And since the West always attacks Russia unfairly, all attacks on Putin, therefore, are unfair. It's really very, very logical if you just think about it like a Russian. All right, point number 4. Russians, and Putin in particular, do not believe in growing the pie. Instead, the whole world is a zero-sum game. To the average Russian, talk of win-win solutions, a rising sea raises all boats, and so on and so forth, makes about as much sense as what you might hear from a guy wearing a tinfoil hat talking about mind control. Russians simply know that the world is a zero-sum game, and America's loss is Russia's gain, and vice versa. Now, you can't ask the average Russian why it's true. It just is. That is the way the world is. A 5th point is a little off to the side, but I think it's going to be important also when you read and hear about Russian foreign policy. And this is that the Russian-China dynamic has flipped, and it flipped years ago. This one will come in handy when reading articles in particular, especially some of the scholarly articles that I think miss the idea of some of Russia's foreign policies. For decades, Russia was the undisputed leader of the non-developed and particularly non-democratic world. This was true not just among those countries that openly aligned themselves with the Soviet Union. It was true even among almost all developing countries that called themselves non-aligned, or any country that harbored doubts about capitalism or the true effectiveness of Western liberal democracy in their own country. Russia was the model. It was the only model that seemed to be there to follow. China is now the undisputed leader of the non-developed world and the non-democratic world. China is more able to project both economic and political power than Russia. China's decisions and its policies are more closely studied and emulated around the world. Chinese connections, and of course particularly Chinese investment, is more sought after than are Russian connections. Now, looking beyond the developing world, the influence that China has on the fully developed world, on thinking in the United States, Europe, and Japan, is beyond anything the Soviet Union ever had. The Soviet Union was always seen as somebody or an organization that was trying to perpetuate and live in a myth without a lot of substance. What China does and what China says is taken seriously around the world. That is something the Soviet Union never succeeded in. So when you read, this one came to mind in particular for me when I was reading Professor Lynch's comments, saying that Putin and Russia have abjured dreams of world leadership. Well, remember this basic fact about China, and maybe you'll look at Putin's actions differently. He didn't abjure dreams. He's just making tactical adjustments in policy to cope with the world as it exists today as effectively as he can. Putin didn't give up on the world. He's just making these adjustments in the hopes that in the future, the flip will happen again and he will be in a position to be more effective than he is. But for now, he's deploying his resources intelligently and tactfully. All right, my last point, and this one is the most important one of all, and it's one that I wish I didn't even need to say, and that is there is no moral equivalency between the United States and Russia, or between US policy and Russian policy. I do not for one moment dispute the fact that the United States has lots of problems and lots of flaws. The reality is that the USA is a country that does not always live up to its founding principles or its declared morals. We make mistakes. Well-intentioned Americans, and also not so well-intentioned Americans, sometimes do implement policies that they then hide from the American people or lie about. That is something that we have to deal with. Oh, by the way, total aside, but you should really go see The Post, which is based upon a key episode that I think led to this lack of faith in institutions that I spoke of earlier. Most of the older people here, like myself, are saying yes, because you remember it. Younger people, this is the Pentagon Papers, and I think it was a key step in bringing the United States to where we are today. Anyway, back to the main topic. Despite our mistakes, Americans, by and large, share certain core beliefs in democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. Now, Americans can argue, and do argue a lot, about what the law should be, but they agree that laws matter. In Russia, written laws have relatively little meaning. In a nation where the ends always justify the means, laws are basically viewed as yet another tool to accomplish your policies. If Putin wants something done, or someone arrested, or dead, then his wishes will be fulfilled. What the law says is irrelevant. Now, to quote Lenin again, shoot those who conspire against you or let them swing. Don't worry about the red tape. Now, that's an attitude, I've read Lenin, but actually that goes back to the czars. This is something that has been a part of Russian culture for hundreds of years, and it's one that Putin is deeply esteemed in and believes in. Anyone with even a slight knowledge of Russia understands that the instant Putin announced that he's running for re-election, the election was over. That is not true in the United States. We are different. When President Trump responded to a question about the killing of journalists in Russia with the statement that there are lots of bad people in the USA as well, he denied that fundamental difference and fulfilled the fondest dreams of generations of Russian propaganda apparatchiks. Political snipes aside, the truth is that we are different, so don't be tricked by false moral equivalencies, and particularly by the type of what about arguments that are so common. It's like, what about this thing the US did in 1942? And it's like, okay, didn't say we're perfect, but moral equivalency does not exist. Don't be fooled. There are literally legions of Russian trolls who are pushing out these what about arguments to try to create this feeling of moral equivalency. Think back to what I said before. If all countries are corrupt, if all words mean nothing, if laws mean nothing, then why bother striving for democracy? Now, before I end, I will spend a few minutes actually doing what I was asked to do, describing Russia's foreign policy today. Basically, Professor Alan Lynch was correct when he wrote that under President Vladimir Putin, Russia is projecting an autocratic model of governance abroad and working to undermine the influence of liberal democracies, namely around Russia's historical borderlands. Overall, I think Professor Lynch did a great job in his piece that was the sort of basis for this talk. But I don't agree with many things he said. I'll give you some of my unvarnished views, and hopefully you can see how my points that I gave you feed into these. For example, as I've already pointed out, Putin did not, as Lynch stated, abjure global ambitions in favor of regional objectives. He's a pragmatist who's made some tactical adjustments. As I discussed earlier, China's far greater global influence means that Russia can't compete, particularly economically, in so many areas. So why waste your resources? Come on, Putin's a little smarter than that. Secondly, unlike what Professor Lynch seemed to imply, Putin's 2001 speech to the Bundestag was not a reflection that Russia is part of Western European nature. Instead, it was an example of the type of pragmatic, directed lying that I discussed earlier. Putin was saying exactly what he believed would advance Russia's interests. He was very good at it. My German colleagues at the time were not only not fooled, they were really scared because Putin did it really, really well. As many of them commented to me, Putin speaks German better than almost any German. I'm a bit surprised that someone as well informed as Professor Lynch seems to have mistaken Putin's words at face value. Maybe I just misread him, but he seemed to actually believe it. I also don't agree with Professor Lynch that there is a apparent consensus in Washington that there can be no true progress in the relationship as long as Putin remains in power. Experienced career Russia hands know this is not true. Instead, we simply have to have realistic goals and approach carefully and pragmatically. If you're waiting for Russia to certainly transform itself into Denmark or Switzerland, or maybe Idaho, I don't know, before you improve relations, well, you're never going to accomplish anything. More on that in a minute. Lynch's analysis of President Yeltsin's Russia has lots of good insights. But he should have really started with two basic facts in order to couch those. First, Boris Yeltsin was a brave, sometimes charismatic leader of a revolt. Definitely right person, right place, right time. He was a horrible president who was absolutely unable to manage a large, complex government operation. Second, the Soviet Union was, and had been for decades, basically a kleptocracy, where corruption was the actual mode of government operation. As a weak manager, Yeltsin was completely unable to change that and in fact made it worse following the fall of the Soviet Union. For those who worked in Russia before the fall, it was really shocking that anyone could make it worse. But yes, he succeeded. The rot of corruption, or the cancer, as Lee Kuan Yew calls it, weakened the nation. It really hurt ordinary Russians, and it built support for a return to this idea that Russia must always have a strong leader. Silny President, silna Россия. So it laid the groundwork for what we see going on today. Now, on the plus side, Lynch's 9 core Russian assumptions are really good. I might have worded a few differently, but they are certainly in line with everything I've said today. Lynch's analysis of Chechnya, Georgia, and Ukraine, on the other hand, is pretty accurate, but he makes one glaring error that can really put you off. And that is, he states in all these instances, Putin filled an emerging power vacuum. Okay, that sounds like a reasonable thing for Putin to do, actually. You don't want a power vacuum on your border. I would instead propose that Putin played on existing weaknesses and tensions in the area to create a manufactured crisis that led to a power vacuum so that he could then step in. There certainly was a power vacuum in Ukraine, for example, but it did not occur without very heavy Russian assistance. The argument, by ignoring this, it's a bit like saying, oh, look, this guy saved somebody from the burning building, he's a hero, and ignoring the fact that that person lit the fire. You've really got to think about the origins here. Lynch's ethnic map of Ukraine, along the same lines here, is basically wrong, as nearly all such maps are, since they ignore the incredible complexity of residence, linguistic, and ethnic patterns. Complexities that have existed since even before the concept of nation states existed. You can't draw the neat lines that we really like to see in our world today when dealing with an ancient place. Just as one example, Sumy, which on Lynch's map is right in the middle of a solidly Russian area, is regarded as one of the cradles of Ukrainian language, culture, and civilization. It's what happens when you want to have a big block of color rather than something that looks more like a bad case of measles, because you have Russian and Ukrainian all next to each other and all interspersed. Now, it's also difficult for me to understand how anyone, and this is what Professor Lynch did, could discuss Crimea without mentioning the fact that Crimea was, for centuries, the homeland of the Crimean Tatars. Tatars ceased being the dominant population group only when Stalin murdered most of them and deported the rest. Looking back, Crimea has been part of the Mediterranean world, as opposed to the Russian world, since Jason and the Argonauts landed there in mythical times. It has also been part of the Scythian realm in ancient Greek times. It was never, prior to the Russo-Turkish War, Russian. So if you want to have a historical reason for who should control Crimea, it's not Moscow. Lastly, I think Lynch's analysis of the reset policy, that famous American policy, is largely correct, but frankly, he gives too much credit to the Obama administration because he said that they were finding a way to balance the overextension of the Bush era. In my admittedly somewhat cynical view, and I like to think it's cynicism born of experience, the reset began as a slogan, was adopted as a slogan, and then went off in search of a policy. That origin set the stage for its failure. In the USA, the reset was dreamed of as a way of essentially taking a deep breath. If you've been in a meeting with a facilitator, this is the reset. Then coming back to the negotiation table with an open mind and good willingness to cooperate. Russia, and Putin in particular, however, when they heard reset, viewed this as a gift from heaven. They interpreted it to mean that Moscow could simply pocket all of the incursions it's made into Syria, Georgia, Ukraine, Central Asia, everywhere else in the world, and then come to the table and saying, okay, all that in the past we'll ignore, even playing field, let's start forward, we get to keep everything. Well, this clean slate approach was never what we intended. Now, the extreme disparity between the US and Russian interpretations, I would say, reflects the dangers of leading with a catchy slogan designed to appeal to domestic US audiences, and then looking for a policy to implement it later. Like I said, I can be a little cynical at times. All right, some of you might be feeling a little pessimistic now, or at least thinking that I'm pessimistic about possibilities for constructive US-Russia relations. But nothing could be farther from the truth. There are tons of areas where we can and should cooperate with Russia today, on everything from preserving threatened, endangered Pacific salmon, to calming unrest in hotspots around the world, to continuing to cooperate to stop the spread, or at least to limit the spread, of nuclear weapons. How can I be optimistic after telling you of how difficult it is to deal with Russia and how they lie and so on and so forth? Well, we can do it as long as we walk in prepared and have skilled people leading us. Working constructively with Russia requires understanding what motivates Russia overall, as well as on each individual particular issue. In other words, deep substantive knowledge. I'll take an example. The spread of terrorist organizations along Russia's southern flank, Dagestan, the Caucasus, parts of Central Asia, that's not in Russia's interest. It's not in our interest. So, cooperation on that would seem to make sense. However, having identified an area of possible constructive cooperation, we must refine it and make sure that our understanding of each side's goals and aspirations is correct. Moscow is, after all, first and foremost, concerned about domestic terrorism. So they're going to want any cooperation to target people who want to move from somewhere in the Caucasus, let's say, to Moscow to cause mayhem. The US, guess what? We're more concerned about people who are going to move from Chechnya or wherever to the US or Europe to cause mayhem. So we have the same broad goal, but specifically we need to work on aligning that. And so both sides will naturally want to swing cooperation. We need to detail what we're actually going to do. Next, we have to weigh costs. Moscow would naturally prefer a program in which the US provided all the funds, opened up all of our intel channels to Russia, and then turned everything over for Russia to implement. That's pretty much what Putin pitched to President Trump not long ago when he suggested establishing a joint intelligence sharing organization to combat terrorism. Now, that is what Putin wants. It doesn't mean we have to simply agree with him in order to cooperate. Instead, we need to sit down and negotiate with experienced people on both sides of the table. The Russians approach such as warily as we approach them, and work out a specific program that serves all of our interests. Once you've agreed with Moscow on a program, not just the program in broad, but the individual methods, operations, and tactics to be used, we also need to decide upon routine checks to see how we're doing. If the program does not meet our interests and we're not able to make it meet our interests, we have to be willing to stop. That's an important point because it's common for Russia, and I'll admit a little less common for the US, but not unheard of, to fail to implement parts of an agreement that benefit the other side. So you've got to watch it every day. Just sort of think of Ronald Reagan's trust, but verify, and verify, and verify. Now, I won't say it's easy to take all these steps because it's not, but it can be done, and it has been done successfully over and over again for 80 or 100 years. From the denuclearization of Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus, to the protection of the North Pacific salmon, the US and Russia have worked together very, very successfully, despite all the distrust, despite all the areas where we disagree, we cooperate where we agree. Every case of successful cooperation, however, is not based just upon some politician or policy statement saying, oh, we should accomplish this. It's based upon a lot of work to decide exactly what will be accomplished, how it will be accomplished, and how roles will be defined. There are so many areas that we can cooperate on. I can't begin to go into them, but I will give you one caution. When searching for areas of cooperation, we always have to be ready to walk away. If Russia believes that we are absolutely committed and will never give this up, well, guess what kind of bargain we're going to get? It's a bit like deciding you want to buy a car and you walk onto the new car lot and you see one you like. So you walk up to the dealer and say, oh, I love this car. I have to have it. I'll pay anything. And then you go to negotiate the price. Diplomacy is really no different. If you want to make a good deal, you have to be ready to walk away. And that's a tough one because politicians, and American politicians fit in this very well, like to announce the big successes often before they happen. They announce a new policy as if the goal of the policy has already been achieved when it hasn't. And it makes it very hard for them to walk away. So we have to have politicians who either have the guts to say, no, it didn't work, or the restraint to wait for announcing success until after success occurs. Remember my comments earlier, I can be a little cynical, so forgive me if I'm being too cynical. Okay, so the summary is that it's not a good time with Russia. I won't say it is, but we can cooperate. And not only that, we can cooperate despite the fact that Putin continues to try to undermine US democracy. He is currently trying to undermine European elections. All these things continue. We are going to disagree. We will fight over those things. At least I hope we will. But it doesn't mean we can't cooperate in other areas. And in the long term, it's the cooperation in those other areas that becomes vital. Because when, and I hope it does, the situation begins to change, having people who are working together day to day and who have learned how to work together is what allows us to be effective. If we can be effective as enemies, or at least as competing powers, then just think of how much more effective we can be as allies. But you have to have that basis of knowing how to work with each other. And that's why not only can we, but we have to cooperate with Russia, even in today's circumstances. So, I hope I didn't go too long. I think I did. Habit.
Thank you so much. In the area of looking forward optimistically, where does John Huntsman fit into that? Has his experience in and of itself played well, or have you or comparable folks with your type of experience and perspective been able to provide him some input?
I do not have very specific current insights on how things are working out. You know, his experience, I can only say from history, he was as political appointee ambassadors go, he was probably about a dream ambassador to China. First off, he spoke Chinese. That already puts you above every other American political appointee ambassador in history. Or maybe there's one exception, but not only that, he was willing to listen to his staff and work with them and learn, so he had lots of good qualities. I hope and assume all that's continuing in Russia, but he didn't walk into Russia with this incredible background knowledge like he did when he walked into China. So he's got a steeper learning curve to go there.
Hi. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. Maybe this is the American in me being confused, but I'm not sure I understand where Putin's endgame is on this, because as the U.S. pulls back in terms of its overseas relationships, especially in the developing world, it's not just when you talk about zero-sum type of calculations, it's not that simple, because it's not like we're pulling back and then Russia wins. It's we're pulling back and China moves into most of those places. China's influence in Africa, and it's even we're seeing it in Central America now. That can't, I would think that would make them even more nervous or more anxious. It would be even worse situation for them. So I'm kind of puzzled by where that's going to end up.
It's a great question, and this is one of the things I cut from my talk when I was trying to edit it down to be less than 6 hours. To understand Russian policies in reality, you've got to look at every vector, at every country and every region, and it's going to vary depending upon Russia's understanding of its own interest. The places where Russia is most trying to get the U.S. to withdraw right now is in the former Soviet Union. For example, some of the statements from President Trump have been pretty disconcerting, but I think so far the professionals have rolled back the president's comments about not defending the Baltic states or leaving Slovakia on its own. That is where Putin and Russia really wants to see us withdraw. Same thing in Syria. Remember Trump's comments about, oh, we should let Putin and Russia take care of policing Syria. They'll be able to fix it. Boy, I'm sure Putin popped the champagne on that one. That was a great comment. Now, once again, the professional apparatus, his own national security advisor, seemed to have got him to forget that particular tweet. And so it's been success. That's not to say that Russia wants us to withdraw from every country on earth. In fact, there are places where we do work together today, and that's because Russia finds it in their interest to do that. Part of that has to do with China. Part of it has to do with a Russian interest in world stability. There are countries where, frankly, things aren't going very well, and neither the United States nor Russia nor China, for that matter, for example, want more pirates coming off the Somali coast and capturing ships or sinking them. And so the policy is much more nuanced than the broad brush I gave you. So while Putin does want to undermine our ability to act on the world stage, it's not as if it's a uniform policy. It's much more pointy than that and much more directed toward regions.
Thank you. You stressed the importance of being able to think like a Russian. Now, when the reset started, is there a sufficient cadre of career diplomats in the State Department who are able to think Russian, or would the politicians take over? Carrying into the Trump administration, I hear that the State Department is being decimated. And what happens? Are there any people left that could think like a Russian?
There are people left. There are many fewer than there were. As you probably know, I think 80% of the most senior diplomats, career diplomats in the State Department have now resigned. And of the next one or two ranks down, it's about 40%. In previous times, the depth of Russian knowledge in the State Department has actually been incredibly deep. Like when I first started serving in Russia, by the time you showed up there on day one, you worked in Russian only. You had no interpreter. You had nobody to help you. You were off on your own. I still vividly remember my first trip to Siberia. In those days, you couldn't buy round-trip tickets because the phones and things didn't work. So I was sitting alone in the airport with my one-way ticket to Siberia. It makes you rethink your life choices. But that depth has been there. But the problem with that depth, and I shouldn't say it's a problem, how about a limitation on it, is something like the reset is a classic example of something that didn't come up and wasn't vetted down. It was politicians sitting around a table saying, wow, that sounds good, I can sell it. And then giving it to the people who know what they're doing and say, put a policy on this. And then people have to scramble to figure out what that policy is going to be. I lived through this also, for example, in Central Asia when the U.S. came up with the Silk Road. Well, for anybody who knows anything about history, the path that Secretary Clinton was talking about had nothing to do with the historic Silk Road. There might have been a couple of countries that were involved in both, but she was talking about an entirely different set of connections. But nonetheless, everybody was told, go out here and make this into the Silk Road. Of course, it made China mad because they kind of feel a little ownership for Silk Road terminology. It also confused a lot of countries who were not part of the Silk Road and says, wait, I thought we were part of this. And it's like, you are, but, rhetoric. But so this is just a comment from a former career person about how the politics and domestic politics, even in the United States, can just make our job harder. And now with a decimated State Department, and it really is decimated, I think it's going to be even harder yet. However, you know, as we've said, Ambassador Huntsman really does listen to people. He is an open individual. Recently, on a different part of the world, Secretary Tillerson actually managed to get appointed by the White House and confirmed a career expert as the new Assistant Secretary for East Asia. Pretty much everybody else who's been appointed does not fall into that category. So there are some glimmers of hope here. I don't want to say the sky is falling. Maybe it's just lots of pine cones or hail hitting our head. I don't know. All right, yes.
Hi. Hi. Question here. Thank you again for a great talk.
Oh,
it's
hello.
always interesting to hear you. I had a question. Do you think Russia will ever be able to change domestically and internationally without first coming to terms with its imperial past and present? And, for example, taking responsibility for starting World War II together with Nazi Germany, invading Poland, invading other European states? Because when I talk to Germans my age, they know history, they take responsibility, post-Germany atoned for its crimes, but Soviet Union never did. And talking to Russians, both in Russia and even here, they don't seem to take the responsibility and recognize the occupied and continue occupied European countries.
The short answer is yes, I think they can. I'm not saying it wouldn't be a good thing for them to recognize, but what you're saying is, will Russia become Germany? Will they begin to think like Germany, and is that a prerequisite for change? And I don't think it is. I think that the hope for change in Russia lies with a slice of the younger population. Some of you who know a little bit about Russia might know that the majority of Russians are not well educated. The education system has been going downhill, particularly at the primary and secondary levels. And so young Russians, many of them, are relatively uneducated, and they're much more likely to be anti-American, anti-West, and pro-Putin than are people much older than themselves who actually lived through the Soviet Union and knew what it was really like. But there is still a large number, millions, of well-educated young Russians, young meaning primarily from the post-Soviet or soon, not too long in, Soviet Union period, who have lived and worked abroad, who know banking and finance, and who work either in the oil industry or heavy industries and have these day-to-day connections. And they can see for themselves that the rest of the world operates differently than does Russia. And my experience in talking to them, they pretty much would much prefer that Russia operated like the rest of the world. Now, this is not a revolutionary group. This is primarily the intelligentsia and the business intelligentsia, more than that, even more than the academic one. And so I don't foresee any near-term changes, but over time, I think it can happen. It makes me think of something I've heard over and over in serving in communist and former communist countries. And this was, I was at a dinner once with Lee Kuan Yew, the former president of Singapore. And he said the problem with development strategies is that when an autocratic government implements one, at some point what they find out is that the middle class that they've been developing is a very demanding group. They're not willing to put up with being told what to do. And if you have laws and rule of order, for example, in the economy to help the economy grow, they're going to come back and look at you and say, but what about in politics? What about in this? How about transparency and accountability across the board? Wow, that's a tough one. And a lot of countries either go through some sort of revolution or crackdown. There's two different ways to go here as that happens. And I think in the long term, Russia could change. And it could change even with a mythical idea of its past. Maybe eventually in the far, far future, it'll have a more accurate idea. Although it makes me think of another old Russian saying, which is Россия ta strana nepredusказуемый прошлым. Russia is a country with a very unpredictable past.
Hello, Ambassador.
I recently heard a Russian fable. I was wondering if you could repeat that about the fox, the crow, and the lion.
Well, that's actually a Greek one, but I will repeat it. The only reason I point out it's Greek is it's interesting, again, if you get to know Russia a little bit. The Russians, and this has to do with history and linguistics, but they have adhered much more closely to the sort of Greek origins. You know, think about St. Cyril and the alphabet, and for that matter, the Orthodox Church, than the Latin branch and the Renaissance branch. But anyway, so this old saying is a story about the fox, the crow, and the lion that had been out hunting together all day, and they found that they could be very effective, you know, with the crow flying and the fox running and the lion. And then when they sat down at night, they had this huge pile of game, and the lion turned to the fox and said, "You, sir, you're very intelligent, divide it up perfectly equally." And so the fox did that. He divided it up so equally. He weighed everything. It was perfect. The lion looked at it, reached out his paw, killed the fox, put the piles together, threw him on top, and then turned to the crow and said, "Why don't you divide it perfectly equally?" And then the crow said, "Of course." He shoves the entire pile in front of the lion and puts one small mouse in front of himself. And the lion says, "Wow, where did you learn to divide so equally?" And he says, "The fox taught me."
All right. We are out of time for today. I'm very, very sorry. We could probably sit here all afternoon. Ambassador, thank you so much. You're always one of my favorite, most vibrant speakers we have. Before you all run out, for any of you who came in here and we had that Soviet bread line, and you didn't get to check yourself off at registration, please stop up here so we know who is in the room. Not to sound Soviet, but we want to know who you are and where you are at all times.